Well, welcome to today's session. Today I'm going to opine on something that is in the media, something that is relevant to the general theme of our sessions, which is targeted towards young men. I'm doing that for a reason, although I'm going against what I usually focus on. But nonetheless, I think it's a very useful canvas to elaborate on some of the things that I have shared previously, specifically in relation to young men becoming their best selves. Let me begin today's session by sharing my first awareness of the power, yet subtle, influence that a role model can have on a young man's life. In this case, I'm not referring to myself. I'm referring to someone who was a student of my father. Now, my father taught two subjects that I recall. One was engineering thermodynamics, and the second was fluid mechanics. And he had a student who was his best student, who became quite friendly with my father. And as a young boy, I observed something that I thought was very interesting. And it wasn't just myself. My friends also observed the same thing. There was a time when I was growing up when this young man, who was much older than myself and my brothers, was thought to be my father's son for a number of reasons. He dressed like my father. He started to walk like my father. His mannerisms changed to be that of my father's. My father wore specific sunglasses, specific style and shade. He started wearing the same sunglasses. He started wearing the same type of shoes and sandals, even the choice and the selection of clothing. And a lot of people at some point brought this to my attention by asking whether he was my elder brother. I was still very young, but I could see a lot of resemblance. In many ways, it took me a while to understand the subtle influence of a good role model on a young boy's life, or in a young boy's life. The man in question did not have a good relationship with his father. He looked to my father as, in his opinion, the right role model. And there is a saying that a chain of habits are too light to be felt until they become too heavy to be broken. The point of that statement being that association can be very subtle. The impact associations or influences of other people have on your life can be very, very subtle. Hence, you have to stand guard at the gate of your mind, and the gates meaning your ears and your eyes, what you hear, what you see, and the energy you have around you. In any case, I found the admiration this young man had towards my father to be very inspiring. Of course, I knew that my father was a good role model. I grew up into the man that I am today as a result of having a good father, a good role model in the house, someone to emulate. Now, let me share perhaps something else that I think is quite interesting. Now, we had 3 boys in the family, and it came as no surprise that none of my father's sons was ever involved in anything that was considered, from a societal point of view, to be inappropriate. None of us went to prison. None of us was ever involved in anything that was remotely close to being considered a breach of the community values or ethics or even the law. In many ways, whether I go ahead going forward with my life and I continue in that path, we can all say that he must have done something to raise us in a certain way to ensure that we were not a menace to society. Now, I start today's session with that story for a reason. Role models are important. And over the weekend, we got an opportunity to see one of the most important influences on young boys, irrespective of race, but particularly within the Black community. We saw a role model communicate to the current generation, but also communicate to the future generation on what he believed was the appropriate behavior that young boys or young men should express. I'm talking about Will Smith and his altercation with Chris Rock. Now, I have no intentions of going into the detail of what was said and what wasn't said, what was right or what wasn't right. What I would like to do is extract from the event a number of lessons that I hope most young men can hold to heart. Now, let's start today's session with the whole concept of the joke. It's important to understand the role of jokes in our lives. Jokes are neither right nor wrong, bad nor good. The jokes are inherently, you might use the word either neutral or contain an element of the truth, no matter how small. The way we interpret the joke determines the feeling that we associate with that joke. In other words, the frame we use to accept, or the perspective, the lens through which we look at the joke determines whether we give the joke more life than the joke requires. Now, this is very, very important, especially for young men, for a number of reasons. As you grow from your early stages and you go into your teenage age and into being a young man and being a mature man, men generally, we make mistakes. Our ego, our desires, and our insecurities have a way of sabotaging our potentiality and our potential. So in many ways, one of the things a young man has to learn how to do is to get hold of the few obstacles that could, if unchecked, that could sabotage what should be a bright future. Emotions, ego, desires. Now, under desires, you have a derivative. You have things such as the desire for power, the desire for fame, the desire for sex. All of those are energies. You have to channel the energy in the right way. Words can trigger a misalignment of energy in a man, whereby what is intended to cause offense is received, but doesn't cause offense, because the receiver recognizes how best to maintain some form of equilibrium in their state of consciousness. Now, let me bring in something that I think is important to recognize. In today's society, unfortunately, we have regressed over the last 40 years in such a way that I think that it would take at least 3 generations to correct the path that we are on. By regression, I'm referring to the fact that a lot of the principles, the foundation principles that have held society together in all walks of life, we seem to be disregarding all of those principles. Let me be specific. In today's society, or let me start from what used to be. There was a time when offense had to be given. The offense had to be received. The offense could then be accepted. In many ways, someone could say something that was intended to be offensive. The receiver controlled whether he gave the offense power, depending on how he responded to the words. Well, in many ways, one could say that as a result of the erosion of some of our cultural values, the liberalization of certain belief systems, the adoption of certain progressive ideas, that in today's society, people take offense even when offense is not given. People are happy to receive offense even when the offense has not been given, or when the offense is not intended. Now this brings us to the events that took place over the weekend with Will Smith and Chris Rock. Many people have not actually seen the movie G.I. Jane, and so most people are reacting to what they believe the movie was about, and they're interpreting Chris Rock's joke in a negative way, or in a negative light. For those who haven't seen the movie, I don't think anyone who is objective could watch that movie and not recognize the hidden story, the philosophy behind the film. In many ways, that film brought to light a lot of the struggles that women had in being accepted into what was a man's world. That's the first thing. Showing a woman who could thrive against all odds. Determination, focus, resilience, grit, refusal to back down, because she believed that she was equal to any man on the team, and she believed in her dream. Now, anyone who thinks that that is not something positive has got something wrong with it. We should be encouraging women to recognize their greatness, their uniqueness, notwithstanding whatever subtle biological limitations that we both have, both in relation to biology, but also in terms of our social inclinations, by things people choose to do. The second part of the movie has to do with an awareness of how much individuals sacrifice for the sake of defending their country, to become a Marine, to join the army, effectively to dedicate your life in service as a public servant for the good, for the preservation of the country. Anyone who does not recognize that as a sacrifice worth celebrating has got something wrong with them. So from the start, the G.I. Jane movie should be one of a complementary nature. The fact that Chris Rock referred to G.I. Jane could have been taken in two ways. Now, I am presenting a biased perspective. We're all biased in our temperament. I am saying the G.I. Jane reference could have been seen as a joke, but emphasizing something interesting. Number one, You can overcome whatever you're going through. Number two, you have what it takes. The fact that Jada Pinkett was compared to the lady who played G.I. Jane, in many ways, I thought it was something positive. But there was another side of the joke which had to do with the way she looked. She was more the G.I. Jane, as you would imagine. If you joined the Marine, if you joined the Army, back in the day you had to have your hair shaved. You had to dress like a man because they were looking for consistency amongst the ranks, and the Army had to ensure that there were no distractions. So that you could make the argument that there was a part to the joke that was, I wouldn't use the word inappropriate because, remember, words don't have any meaning except the meaning we give the words. In any case, it was meant to be a joke. Now, why am I emphasizing the whole issue about jokes? Well, the reason is simple. If you don't understand the role that comedians play in our society, then you will not understand anything I'm saying in today's session. If you go back to the 17th century, we did not have a lot of comedians in Great Britain. There weren't a lot of comedians in the United States. Back then it was still a colony of Great Britain. Comedy and the use of words to create or to diffuse the environment amongst which people spent time was seen as almost as an innovation in communication, language, and literature. It was seen as a breakthrough and an opportunity for people to take themselves less seriously. And it was seen as an opportunity to bring to the table issues that most people felt or thought about but couldn't speak about, because to speak about it created an environment, a tension that led to either war, fights, or disagreement, physical disagreement. And so comedians served as almost like gatekeepers, people who could serve as a bridge between what was seen as the political world or the business world and the common man or the common people. And the comic was meant to take a step back, observe what was going on in society, extract a few words, blend those words together, present the words back to the people or the audience in such a way that there was a hidden truth in what they were saying, but there was always a fine or thin line introduced where sometimes they went too far. In any case, the art of comedy really fostered the whole environment of free speech. Free speech is one of the gifts of Western civilization. For those who have not lived outside of the West, it's impossible to understand the gift that we have in the West when we talk about free speech. Now, unfortunately, with free speech comes the freedom that your words could cause offense. The separating line has to always be, was there an intent to cause offense, or was it an innocent joke? Very hard to decide, which is the reason why we as human beings and we as society, we always have to come to the table in good faith. In other words, if someone says, I'm a comedian, and you see them on stage, then you have to assume a good faith attitude, meaning whatever they say is not intended to cause harm to you directly, and therefore, if you choose to take offense, recognizing that offense is not being given, then you have, for whatever reason, chosen a path of least resistance, which often can lead to violence, assault, attacks, which were all unnecessary. Now, I share that simply to explain that what we might be looking at is something quite trivial, something that we say was a mistake, in my opinion, has done more harm to free speech than any free speech event in the last 30 years. Now, we've had over the last 30 years an attack on people who have a certain perspective of what they say, whether they're right of center or left of center. We have never had this level of public attack on a comedian. Now remember, the comedians are supposed to be those who hold the last, effectively they're supposed to be the torch bearers. They hold the keys to that gate that enables we as common people and those who represent us, or those who have different views, they hold that key that enables both parties to diffuse what could be a very tense perspective on issues about life. I believe that Will Smith, through his actions, advocated violence like we've never seen in the black community before. But also, he advocated violence across all races like we've never seen before. In one action, he diminished what women have been celebrating over the last 15 years, which is that what a man can do, they can also do. In other words, by taking what was meant to be an innocent joke based on a fictional character, which was supposed to liberate women or draw to the world the sufferings that women have had to endure, but show how much one woman triumphed in her will, in her ambition, in her goal to serve her country. One person took what was supposed to be an opportunity for celebration and twisted what was supposed to be an innocent joke, and therefore diminished women by making women, or drawing to the attention of the world, that a certain look in a woman is to be viewed through the pitiful lens. Now, let me say this so that it's very clear. I am very specific about my tastes with regards to what I find attractive in a woman, specifically her hair. Personally, I think, if you ask me, I think Jada Pinkett is amongst perhaps the top 1% of women who can wear that hairstyle and look beautiful. She has a really, really beautiful head, but also her frame is quite small, and usually women who have a smaller frame can get away with very low haircuts. She makes it look beautiful. As a matter of fact, I had no idea that there was something behind the loss of her hair. I thought it was perhaps a fashion statement. She is a beautiful woman. She has always been a beautiful woman. Even with the loss of her hair, she is a beautiful woman. What should have been recognized as a joke, but one that could have been used as a platform for empowering women to be comfortable and happy with whatever look they choose. Now, recognize that I personally, I'm not necessarily one who I prefer longer hair. That's my preference. But what could have been used as an opportunity to say, well, Mensa, although you like long hair, short hair can also be beautiful. That was the platform to use for that you could call stereotype or personal preference to be reappraised. Will Smith used that opportunity to say, yes, it's perfectly okay to have such views about women where you believe their hairs should be longer, irrespective of what the woman might be going through. In that instance, I think that he diminished the struggle, the progress women had made and are making, especially with regards to how they look. You know, what's the next thing? Do we now talk about a woman's nose? Do we talk about a woman's skin? Do we talk about a woman's height? Where do we stop? Because what should have been a beautiful moment, a moment for Jada Pinkett to come and show the world that, yeah, just like G.I. Jane, she is beautiful, she is powerful, she is strong, she is determined, and she has a strong family behind her. Instead, all people think about is we now associate that look with something derogatory. In any case, I think the most devastating impact of Will's actions was that he perpetuated what I call the Black Stereotype. Personally, and this is a personal perspective, I think Will Smith, in one day, in one evening, set the black community, the international black community, not just the American or the African American black community. I'm talking about the international black community. He set the black community back, at least in my opinion, 25 or 30 years. And what we saw was a contrast, because to understand the contrast, you have to look back to the previous Oscars. We had Ricky Gervais, an Englishman, say far worse things for 7 straight minutes. And guess what? Everyone else took it on the chin. At the end of that event, the general feeling was, well, that there is a level of decorum that is expected amongst certain ethnic groups. Even if something is said that is offensive, even if offense was given, in Ricky Gervais's scenario, in some of the jokes, offense was given. The difference was it wasn't accepted or received by the audience. They simply ignored it. In Will Smith's case, the intent was not to cause offense. Offense was taken. But not only was the offense taken, there was retaliation on a public stage in a way that stereotyped the black community as violent, intolerant, too strong-headed, and in many ways lacking a moral compass. Now, most people might say, well, that's a bit too harsh. Well, in London, and prior to the pandemic, every day of the week, hear me out now, there are 200 working days in a year. On every day of the working week, a young black boy was either stabbed to death or killed or shot. In the majority of the cases, the person who was perpetuating that violence shared the same ethnic image as Will Smith. So the stereotype in the UK, especially in London, for young black boys is violence, intolerance, and I go back to what I started today's session with, the absence of fathers in the family, or the absence of good role models in the community that could enable these young men understand life, teach them delayed gratification, teach them how to manage their egos, teach them how to understand how to receive offense even when it is given, and how not to retaliate with emotion, how to be more logical and calm when dealing with things that might seem unacceptable. In one action, one person, and here is this, one of the most painful parts of that effect. I think over the last 25 years, there have been two men who have influenced the black community and generally influenced the movie industry more than most. One of them is Denzel Washington, who in my opinion has been just an absolute class of a man. The second has been Will Smith. Not through my eyes alone, but if you were to stop anyone and ask them, who is your favorite black actor? You always get two names, Will Smith and you get Denzel Washington. My favorite has always been Denzel, not because Will Smith is not a great actor, but more so because of the way he led his life, and he continues to lead his life as a family man. And here is perhaps a take-home assignment. I would like you to search on the internet Denzel Washington's family and pay attention to what you see. You will see a collection of photographs that go back perhaps 30, 40, 50, 60 years from when he was a young man. And in each and every picture you see, there's a consistency. There is something about his demeanor, his gentleness. He has that look of a role model. But more importantly, when you see his family, it's almost as though it's each and every one of them has had that role model effect on their lives. They look beautiful. He has a beautiful family, an incredibly beautiful wife, an incredibly beautiful family. And most of that has come because Denzel chose a path, and he stayed on that path, and interestingly, has never deviated from that path. A very difficult task, but a task that he understood very early, recognizing that there were so many black boys and so many men around the world who did not have fathers and who looked to him as a role model, as a father. And so you always saw a consistency. The contrast is, if you were to search, just like you would have done for Denzel Washington's family, if you were to search for Will Smith's family, suffice it to say that the contrast is very alarming. I'll let you do the search yourself. But something comes to mind, which is there's a disconnect. And in my opinion, my intention is not to critique Will and his family. My intention is to say that there is a saying, there goes the man, or there go the men, there go the society. Every society follows the direction of the men. So when you have a society that is fragmented, ineffective, lost, you also have a sense of loss amongst the men in the society. Men, we have a very, very important role to play in society, beyond yourself. And in many ways, it's important to always remember that your actions, your words, your actions matter at every level of your life. Let me put it in a different way. I once heard someone say that, imagine that every action you took on a daily basis was being recorded, and it was going to be put in a newspaper by a very, very enthusiastic and unfriendly reporter. That you should always act in such a way that if your actions were made public and were put up to scrutiny, that you can look at those words or those actions and not feel ashamed. And also, more importantly, that your parents will not feel ashamed. Now, we all get out of character. And so my intention is not to say that no one is beyond reproach or no one is beyond having flaws. I am a flawed vessel. We are all flawed vessels. But here is where I bring in Will Smith's action. It wasn't a reactive, rather, it was a reactive action because there was a delay. In the absence of a delay, I would still condemn his actions, and I would say it was purely based on emotion. In this case, there was a delay. Now, I wouldn't go into the detail on that, but that delay identified the importance of not being unequally yoked with the wrong person. Now, this is where I bring in part of what we've been trying to do in my sessions, which is to educate you about the importance of making the right decisions in your relationships and how your goals, your dreams, your vision could be sabotaged by making the wrong decision, specifically when it comes to do with women. I have said in many sessions, the decisions you make between 18 and 35 as a young man are very important. The decisions you make before you turn 18 are equally very important. The decisions you make from 35 and above, if you're not careful, you would have already been formed. Your paradigm, your habits already formed based on what you've done previously, and therefore having an understanding about relationships and women and how to make the right decisions, especially relationally, is perhaps one of the most important decisions a man can make. Now, let me, conclude Will Smith's actions by saying this. Unlike many people, I disagree with the idea that his actions were one of protection of his wife and the love he had for his wife and him fulfilling the most important duty of a man to his wife, which is protection. You've heard me talk about provision and protection. Will's actions were not one and did not resemble one of protection. It was retribution and retaliation as a result of what I call the gap. To understand the gap, just go back and watch the clip. You see a pause. There was a gap. In many ways, it was an instruction given to a man from a woman, not in words, in her body language. And the instruction was very simple. Retaliate. And this is where I bring in the importance of the brotherhood. If you look through history, whenever a man, an empire, a nation has been destroyed, most of the time it's come as a result of the decisions the person at the top made, usually men. We look at David, we look at Solomon, and even in more recent times we can look at the Battle of Troy, where Helen of Troy was taken from her husband wrongly, and therefore you had a battle between two great nations, and an entire nation was destroyed. Now, you could say this is a fictional story, but in that fictional narrative is a reality of history, a history that has occurred in several different ways and over different times. The point being, now when men do not take hold of their ego, when men do not take hold of their emotions, and when we do not take hold of our desires, trouble always ensues. It might take 100 years for that trouble to come and bear fruit, but it always comes. As night follows day, and as darkness follows light, it will come. The sins might follow the children and the children's children, but the sins will be paid in full and it will be paid either by the person who has perpetuated that sin, and in most cases by those who follow or who are offsprings of whoever perpetuated that sin. Now, this brings me to an interesting conclusion, which is what should you take out of the event? Well, I hope you don't take out of the event that it's acceptable to use violence against another person, because that is wrong. I hope you take away something I have said in one of the prior sessions, which is you have to know how to fight on your feet, how to fight on the ground, and how to use a fire weapon. Now, I learned most of that very young. I still am actively engaged with all of them. But as I stood there and as I watched this small clip, I couldn't help say to myself, what would I have done? What would I have done? I think I would have done one of three things. And I'll tell you the most likely. Every man, one of the things we learn from history, if you go back to the ancient times, when we were still in tribes, small tribes, and we were during the hunter-gatherer period, when we hunted, one of the things tribes looked out for when they saw someone who was from a different tribe was what's called their gait, the way the person walked. You know, from a distance, you saw someone who was not part of your tribe, and you might call it their walk signaled that the person was coming in peace or the person had bad intentions. This means it's usually very possible to observe someone walking towards you who is over emotionalized and who is coming with bad intentions. No one gets on the stage in an Oscar. Chris Rock should have known that something was coming towards him and it was not good. So what I could have done could have been, as Chris stood there watching, as Will got on stage, you could watch his gait, the way he swayed. You could tell this was not supposed to be a hug. He could have retreated, made a joke of it, but retreated to diffuse the issue. That's the first. So I hold Chris somewhat responsible for the actions, although he was surprised. Now, when Will stopped in front of him, he could see the look on Will's face. It wasn't a friendly look. Point number 2, he should have stopped that slap from getting to him in one of many ways. Now, I'm a trained fighter, so you can either, what we call in Shotokan karate, we call it DI, meaning someone is attacking you and you go in at the same time. And the idea is to get there before they get to you. We call it DI. So the punch lands at the same time, or yours gets there before his. The kick gets to him before his punch or slap gets to you. That's the second. Now, I don't know whether Chris perhaps processed the consequences of the second action. I think he would have, and decided that it was not an intelligent position to take. The third would have been, as soon as he saw Will on stage, he could have offered an apology. And that should have been with the intention of diffusing everything that occurred. In any case, my very nature leads me to the second option. That's what I would have done. But I understand the first, which is to stay there punch or the slap. It was sad. Let me just put it that way. It was very sad. I do have a lot of respect for Chris. I do not think, although most people believe his actions were gentlemanly, I commend him for such actions. I myself would not have taken such an insult on a public stage. It's not part of my temperament. My temperament is slightly different. I could stop the punch or stop the slap, but it's in my instinct, because of the fact that I am trained, to retaliate. In any case, Chris made a decision that I think was the right decision. But post the event, I think he made a wrong decision. The fact that he hasn't pressed charges and hasn't sued, I think in many ways has played its part in doing more harm to the black community and to young men and we as a society, because in principle it says that it's important to accept violence that is perpetuated towards you for something that was not intended to be disrespectful or to cause offense, and that you should take that without retaliation or without some form of retribution. The right thing for Chris to have done should have been, having taken the slap, should have been to press charges. Because by doing that, what we're saying to society is that we have laws, we have rules, we have protocols, there are certain etiquettes that are expected in certain scenarios, and when you breach all of those, there should be consequences. Personally, a lawsuit should have followed in the millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. Why? Well, in the cancel culture we live in today, I can see people say, stop airing Chris Rock's historic comedy shows. So not only does he have a financial blow as a result of something that was not intended to be harmful, I can also see his finances being affected by future gigs. So part of the lawsuit should have been for $300 million and perhaps negotiated down to 150 and settled, which would have meant that between now and the next 10 years, Will Smith would have been working for Chris to pay back restitution for an action he took, which was unnecessary. Now that brings me to what I've heard from a few people, and women particularly, who say, well, the action was one that showed he was trying to protect his wife. A lot of the women who are saying this are also people who believe in the feminist, womanist movement, who believe men and women are equal, in which case the action of Will Smith defeats the argument that we are equals. If you need your husband to do the slapping for you, then ipso facto we are not equals. Number two, if you need your husband to do the slapping for you, then by implication that means chivalry is alive and well, which counters what we've been hearing, especially in England over the last 10-15 years, where women are saying, we don't want those old-fashioned virtues and habits and etiquettes that men used to exhibit back in the 18th and 19th and 20th century. This is the 21st century. We don't need you to open the door. We don't need you to protect us. We are equals. Now, if that's the case, you can't have it, your cake and eat it. It's either one or the other. Either masculinity is toxic or masculinity is just masculinity. You cannot have both. So for the few men, in my opinion, she-men, beta males and weak men who believe that Will's actions were credible because he was defending his honor or defending his wife's honor or defending his wife from verbal abuse. I just hope, let me leave you with this parting gift. I just hope that someday your son, your daughter, is not involved in an altercation by someone on the street who is very radical, who takes what was not intended to be an offense, but who takes it as an offense and retaliates in such a way that is perhaps not just a slap, perhaps it's the loss of a life. I hope that you don't get to feel the pain of having to look back at your words or your emotions in relation to this event. I hope you don't look back and say, perhaps I was wrong. I'll leave you with the following last words. We men, we die, that's what we do. And over the last 2 or 3 centuries, the value of a man has been reduced down to his willingness to give his life, either for family, for country, or for something he loves or someone he loves. There's a difference. In the 19th and in the 18th and in the 17th century, you were giving your life in exchange for something that was effectively sacred in its beliefs. There was honor in what a country was. There was honor in what a family was. There was honor in what you were getting as a wife, a virgin, untouched, someone who had not been intertwined with someone either emotionally, spiritually, physically, or mentally. So you were giving your life in exchange for something of equal or greater value. Let me say this to the young men out there today. The sexual marketplace has been deregulated. Sex is now a commodity, the cheapest, in my opinion, of commodities. I don't care who you meet out there. I don't care who she is. It takes a great woman to know how to calm a man down, and to encourage a man to know how to choose his battles. You should not be choosing battles that do not have rewards. And I will close by saying, in today's society, when it comes to relationships, there are very few battles that are worth you giving your life for. So think about the idea, and disagree if you want to, but just remember, you're here on this earth for a reason, to fulfill a potential. Your potential is God's gift to you. What you do with that potential is your gift back to the world. Let's assume, for whatever reason, that slap was much harder than it turned out to be. And let's say that Chris Rock had a brain hemorrhage and he had internal bleeding. And let's say he died 2 days after the event. What you would have seen would have been the loss of 2 potentials. Will Smith, because then he would have been charged for murder, and Chris Rock, because he would have been killed. But not just that, that would have had a ripple effect on their families and on society. All for what? A bad joke? Maybe a taste list. He had no taste? Yeah, I could give you that. But it was a joke. I've seen this a lot in most young men that I interact with socially. I see it a lot in the gym. There is an aggression, an anger, and hostility, a frustration amongst a lot of young men. And in each case, when I ask, the fathers are not there. There are no role models. A lot of these young men have been raised by single mothers. There's been no one to say, listen, that is anger, but there's nothing wrong with being angry. Anger is simply an emotion that requires an appropriate focus. You need to channel that energy in a different direction. You don't retaliate with the energy. You know how to control your emotions. Otherwise, your potential will be like those of so many people. It goes with them to the grave. It goes with them to their resting place. And for most people, men and women included, there is no place on earth that carries more, you could call wealth, potential, than the graveyards. Because that's where most people take their dreams, their goals, their potentials to, simply because of an emotion that they could not control. I would recommend to you as a young man, if you are one, to start to practice in whatever fashion or whatever way you want to, a daily habit of learning how to control your emotion. I'll tell you this in closing. You will be tested. I have been tested. I have been tested so many times. I have not always passed the test. I will be tested in the future. I know I will fail some of those tests. But I can tell you, in each instance, one of the reasons why I haven't failed every single test was for one reason. I always ask myself a simple question. What would my father think if he heard what I did? Now, I cannot tell you enough how much that civilized me as a young man, stopped me from getting into really, really, really crazy shit, stopped me from getting into very violent things, because I always defaulted back to what would my father say and what would my father think. Now, for those of you who have no role models, perhaps that's an exercise you should look into. Find people who love you too much. Let me say this. Most of you young men have friends, and that is fine. A friend is someone who loves you just the way you are. A mentor, a role model, a disciplinarian is someone who loves you too much to leave you the way you are. That role model can come in different forms. A wife, a spouse, a girlfriend, a father, a friend, a church leader, a football coach, a boxing coach, but someone who can tell you on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, that the David you're chipping away so you can reveal that greatness you have, that the David is still within you, and that you should be careful not to chip away too fast, because you might damage the David within, or might encourage you not to give up on the dream of becoming your best self. And I wish you all the best.